I want to return to the issue of testing, because I think the First Minister has been behind the curve on much of testing, but it's not too late to catch up. What I want to understand is why all the innovations are happening in other parts of the country and other parts of Europe. 8 months into this crisis, we should have the capacity to do more than this. If Slovakia are looking at that testing, and they've tried it over the weekend, if Liverpool are going to test 500,000 people, why are we not looking at that innovation here in Scotland too? We could start with Lanarkshire or Students for Christmas, which I know the First Minister is looking at, but for all we seem to do is keep all options under review. We need to be doing more than this. So can the First Minister give us some kind of timetable for when this kind of innovation is going to happen?
First Minister.
Willie Rennie is just wrong about that in many different respects. So, for example, we have over recent weeks been testing a technology called Lamira testing. We have been doing the clinical validation. We're waiting on the outcome of that so that we can get that in use broadly across our NHS. You can't just start using new technology without going through the proper validation. If I am right, as I understand I am, although I'm clearly not an expert on the Slovakian approach to COVID, but if it is the case, it's antibody testing. Frankly, the judgment of my clinical advisors right now is that doing population-wide antibody testing is not effective, because nobody can yet tell a person what, if they test positive for antibodies, what that means. Does it mean that they are immune for a day, a week, a month, a year, or not at all? So that is not something that our consideration would say is a sensible thing to do right now. We are cooperating with other UK countries on other technological developments, and actually Scotland has a good reputation of not being behind the curve on rolling out new technology, but actually being ahead of the curve. You know, maybe I'm being cynical here, but sometimes we hear about things like the Liverpool pilot, which I'm not knocking. I think we will be looking with interest at that. But we often hear about these things when the testing system more generally is coming under a lot of pressure in England. Let's focus, as we are doing, on building our testing capacity, which we have done dramatically and will do even more by the end of this year, and then using that capacity in the best possible way to limit the spread of COVID. And with all the caveats about not a shred of complacency, I recognise readily, Presiding Officer, that I could be standing here, inadvertently promoted the Presiding Officer, or demoted, whatever way you want to look at it. But I could be standing here next week in a completely different position. But right now, Scotland is in a relatively strong position because of the decisions we're taking and the compliance of the public. And as part of that will be the way we are using testing tactically. So let's keep focusing on the things we need to do to maintain that strong position and stop the COVID position deteriorating. That's what I spend every waking moment doing. It's what the Health Secretary and my colleagues spend every waking moment doing, and that will continue right throughout the winter.
Willie Rennie.
And we all think about that too. We all think about how we can get on top of this virus. This is not the exclusive preserve of front bench ministers. And the First Minister will understand my concerns and my frustrations on all of this. She's only recently been persuaded about the merits of the widespread use of asymptomatic testing. Only just recently did she be convinced about that. So the scale of this is insufficient. We need to move much faster than we have done so far. Now, last week, 854 children and young people tested positive, and 404 people employed in education and childcare the week before that. Schools are now taking extra precautions with senior pupils wearing face coverings, and there's new ventilation and CO2 monitors. But teachers who were shielding earlier this year are still being told they can't work from home. So why is the government taking such a risk with this vulnerable group of people?
Before I come on to shielding, let me just finish off on Willie Rennie's testing point. Another example of us looking at new and developing technology. We're establishing regional testing hubs right now, which will be operational before the end of the year. One of the things they are trialling is the pooling of testing so that you can do more than you can at the moment. So we are not behind the curve on new technology, we're actually pushing ahead with this. With the greatest respect to Willie Rennie, I listen carefully to what he says. I hope he genuinely believes that, because I mean it. But when it comes to decisions about who to test for a virus or not, then I have to listen more to my clinical advisors about the efficacy with asymptomatic testing versus prioritising symptomatic testing. Views on that have changed as the knowledge and evidence around the virus have changed, but I will continue to be driven and guided by the advice that people with expert knowledge have about these things, and we will continue to push ahead with that. In terms of the points about schools generally, I think it is important that we keep schools open if we possibly can, and if that means putting in place more mitigations like the use of face coverings in senior pupils, then I think that is important. So I think we recognise across the chamber in the balance of harms consideration, having young people not at school full time, it does a lot of harm to them. So we must avoid that as far as possible. In terms of shielding, I want to be very clear to employers, whether that is a local authority employer or a private sector or other public sector employer, is that they must exercise extreme caution with those in the shielding category and facilitate working from home if that is for the safety of the person who is in the shielding category. I can't take all of these individual decisions between employers and workers, but I'm very clear that the safety of people who have been in the shielding category is absolutely paramount.
Thank you. Question 5, James Dornan, who joins